The cabin of Flight 347 hummed with the steady drone of engines as it cruised smoothly at 35,000 feet. Captain Marcus Hale, a seasoned pilot with over 2 decades of experience, sat in the cockpit, monitoring the instruments with practiced ease. Outside, the sky was a vast expanse of blue, dotted occasionally by wisps of clouds that drifted lazily past the windows. It was shaping up to be another routine flight from New York to Los Angeles, just like so many others Marcus had commanded. But little did he know, this journey would take an unexpected turn, one that would challenge not only his professionalism, but also his deeply held beliefs. Marcus wasn't just any pilot. Beyond his crisp uniform and calm demeanor lay a man who cared deeply about the world around him. He often tuned into news podcasts during layovers, devouring stories about climate change, social justice, and global politics. His views leaned liberal, shaped by years of witnessing firsthand how interconnected humanity truly was. From the melting glaciers he'd seen while flying over Greenland to the smog-filled skies above major cities, Marcus felt a personal responsibility to advocate for change, even if it meant ruffling feathers along the way. As the autopilot handled the bulk of the work, Marcus decided to stretch his legs and do a quick walkthrough of the cabin. This was standard procedure, ensuring everything ran smoothly and passengers were comfortable. Stepping out of the cockpit, he made his way down the narrow aisle, nodding politely at familiar faces and offering reassuring smiles to nervous flyers gripping their armrests. The economy section buzzed with activity, kids playing games on tablets, couples whispering quietly, and solo travelers scrolling through their phones. Everything seemed normal there. But when Marcus reached first class, something felt different. The air carried a subtle tension, like the calm before a storm. 2 passengers seated near the front caught his attention immediately. One was Richard Leavitt, a well-dressed man in his late 50s whose sharp jawline and commanding presence screamed success. Richard was no stranger to luxury travel. His tailored suit and expensive watch hinted at a life filled with boardroom, meetings, and high-stakes deals. Across the aisle sat Emma Crockett, a young woman in her late 20s with fiery red hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. Her casual yet purposeful attire, a simple blouse paired with jeans, stood in stark contrast to Richard's polished appearance. A stack of papers rested on her tray table, covered in graphs and statistics about carbon emissions. At first glance, they appeared to be having a polite conversation, heads bent close together as though discussing something important. But as Marcus drew nearer, snippets of their dialogue floated toward him, revealing the underlying friction. "You can't keep ignoring the facts," Emma said sharply, her voice carrying just enough edge to draw glances from neighboring passengers. Richard responded with equal intensity, though his tone remained measured. "And you can't expect businesses to shut down overnight because of alarmist predictions." Their argument simmered beneath the surface, simmering with unspoken frustrations. Other first-class passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, pretending not to listen while clearly eavesdropping. Some exchanged wary looks, wondering if the disagreement might escalate further. Marcus hesitated, torn between maintaining his professional distance and addressing the growing unease in the cabin. As captain, his primary duty was to ensure safety, not just physical but emotional as well. Yet stepping in could risk crossing boundaries, especially since the debate seemed rooted in deeply personal convictions. What intrigued Marcus most was the nature of their discussion. Words like corporate greed and climate denial peppered their exchange, hinting at a clash of ideologies. On one side stood Emma, a passionate advocate for environmental reform whose speeches had gone viral online. She represented a new generation demanding accountability from those in power. Opposite her sat Richard, a self-made millionaire whose fortune stemmed from industries often criticized for contributing to ecological destruction. To an outsider, their confrontation might have seemed predictable, a classic battle between idealism and pragmatism. But Marcus sensed there was more to it than met the eye. Curiosity tugged at him, urging him to intervene. After all, he couldn't deny his own stake in the matter. Climate change wasn't just a talking point for Marcus. It was a reality he confronted daily in the skies. Still, he reminded himself of protocol. Pilots weren't supposed to involve themselves in passenger disputes unless absolutely necessary. So why did this particular argument feel so urgent? Was it because he recognized pieces of himself in both Richard and Emma? Or was it simply the weight of knowing that such conversations mattered now more than ever? For several minutes, Marcus lingered near the galley, pretending to review a clipboard while keeping one ear tuned to their escalating voices. Each retort from Emma grew sharper, each rebuttal from Richard firmer. Finally, unable to ignore the mounting tension, Marcus decided to act. With a deep breath, he approached their row, his expression neutral but attentive. "Everything all right? Here?" he asked, his voice calm yet firm. Both Richard and Emma turned to face him, momentarily startled by the interruption. For a brief moment, silence hung in the air, thick and palpable. It was clear that whatever had sparked this heated exchange wasn't going away anytime soon. And as Marcus stood there, poised between neutrality and involvement, he realized this. Flight might become far less ordinary than he'd anticipated. Marcus's question, "Everything all right here?" hung in the air like a fragile thread, holding back the storm brewing between Richard and Emma. Both passengers turned to face him, their expressions a mix of surprise and irritation at being interrupted. Richard was the first to respond, leaning back slightly in his seat as if to create some distance from the situation. "Oh, everything's fine," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand, though his tone betrayed lingering frustration. "Just a spirited discussion." Emma, however, wasn't so quick to let it go. Her green eyes flashed with determination as she glanced up at Marcus. "Spirited? That's one way to put it," she replied, her voice sharp but controlled. "I was just trying to explain why short-term profits can't justify long-term destruction." She gestured toward the papers on her tray table, which were filled with charts and data highlighting rising global temperatures and shrinking ice caps. Richard rolled his eyes slightly, clearly unimpressed by what he likely saw as another lecture. "And I was explaining that innovation, not regulation, is the key to solving these problems," he countered, his voice steady but edged with impatience. He crossed his arms over his chest, signaling that he considered the matter settled, or at least that he wanted it to be. Marcus stood there for a moment, observing the dynamic between them. It was clear that neither side was willing to budge, and the tension radiating off them was palpable. Other passengers nearby had gone quiet, pretending to focus on their books or screens, but undoubtedly listening closely to every word. The last thing Marcus needed was for this disagreement to escalate into something disruptive. But at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that this conversation mattered, not just for these two individuals, but for the bigger picture they represented. With a thoughtful nod, Marcus decided to take a step beyond his usual role as captain. "It sounds like you both have strong opinions about important issues," he began, choosing his words carefully. "If you're open to continuing this discussion somewhere more private, I'd be happy to facilitate. Maybe we could move to the galley for a few minutes." His suggestion came across as neutral yet inviting, leaving room for either party to decline without losing face. At first, Richard seemed hesitant. He raised an eyebrow, studying Marcus with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "The galley," he repeated, as if unsure whether this was a genuine offer or some odd form of mediation. Emma, on the other hand, looked intrigued. Her expression softened slightly and she nodded. "Sure, why not?" she said, gathering her papers and tucking them into her bag. "If Mr. Leavitt is willing to keep talking, I'm game." Richard hesitated for a beat longer before giving a reluctant shrug. "Fine," he said, unbuckling his seatbelt. "But don't expect me to change my mind." With that, the three of them made their way to the small galley area near the front of the plane. It was cramped and utilitarian, designed for flight attendants to prepare drinks and snacks rather than host debates. Still, it provided enough space for the trio to gather around away from prying ears. Once they were settled, Marcus took the lead again, positioning himself between Richard and Emma. "All right," he said, his tone warm but authoritative. "Let's start fresh. Why don't you each share your perspective and I'll listen? No interruptions. just a chance to hear where the other person is coming from. Emma went first, eager to make her case. She spoke passionately about the urgent need for action on climate change, citing specific examples of how unchecked industrial practices had devastated ecosystems and communities. Her voice carried a mix of anger and sorrow as she described wildfires ravaging California, hurricanes battering coastal cities, and entire species teetering on the brink of extinction. "We don't have time to wait for innovation to save us," she insisted, her hands gesturing emphatically. "The science is clear. We need bold policies now, not empty promises." When it was Richard's turn, he listened intently, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his tone was measured but firm. He acknowledged the seriousness of environmental challenges but argued that heavy-handed regulations stifled progress. "Look, I'm not denying there's a problem," he said, meeting Emma's gaze directly. "But punishing businesses isn't the answer. If we incentivize green technology instead of forcing companies to cut corners, we'll see real results. Faster." As the two continued trading points, Marcus found himself caught between admiration and concern. On one hand, he admired Emma's passion and conviction. She reminded him of activists he'd read about, people who refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. At the same time, he understood Richard's perspective too. Having grown up in a working-class family, Marcus knew how much people relied on jobs created by industries often criticized for their environmental impact. Striking a balance between economic growth and sustainability was no easy task. Still, Marcus couldn't help but notice the underlying emotions driving their arguments. For Emma, this wasn't just an intellectual debate, it was deeply personal. Every statistic she cited, every story she shared reflected a worldview shaped by years of witnessing the consequences of inaction. And Richard, despite his confident exterior, seemed defensive, almost as if he felt personally attacked by Emma's accusations. To break the intensity, Marcus interjected occasionally, offering anecdotes from his own experiences as a pilot. He talked about flying over glaciers that had visibly shrunk over the years and seeing smog-blanket cities during takeoffs and landings. "From up here, it's hard to ignore how fragile our planet really is," he said softly. "But it's also amazing to see how resilient people can be when they come together." As the conversation in the galley continued, the initial hostility between Richard and Emma began to soften ever so slightly. Marcus's calming presence had created a space where both of them felt heard, even if they weren't yet ready to agree. The cramped quarters forced them to sit closer than they might have preferred, but it also stripped away some of the formality that had defined their earlier exchange. For the first time, they started to see each other not as adversaries, but as people with deeply personal reasons for their beliefs. Emma leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees as she spoke. Her voice, once sharp and confrontational, now carried a hint of vulnerability. "I grew up in a small town in Oregon," she began, her gaze fixed on a spot just beyond Richard's shoulder. "It was beautiful, forests everywhere, rivers, running clear. But when I was 12, a wildfire tore through everything. My family lost our home and we were displaced for months. That fire wasn't natural. It was caused by droughts made worse by climate change." She paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "After that, I couldn't ignore what was happening. Everywhere I looked, I saw how vulnerable we are. Whole communities disappearing because of rising sea levels, farmers struggling to grow crops. In unpredictable weather patterns, kids like me growing up breathing polluted air." Her hands trembled slightly as she gestured, emphasizing the weight of her words. "That's why I do this work. It's not about politics or ideology. It's about survival. And every day we delay action, more people suffer." Richard listened, silently, his usual confident demeanor giving way to something quieter, more thoughtful. When Emma finished, he didn't immediately respond. Instead, he stared down at his clasped hands, his jaw tightening as though wrestling with emotions he wasn't used to confronting. After a long moment, he finally spoke, his voice softer than before. "I wasn't always rich," he admitted, surprising even himself with the admission. "My dad worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, and my mom cleaned offices at night. We lived paycheck to paycheck, never knowing if the next month would bring enough to cover rent. When I got older, I swore I'd do whatever it took to make sure no one in my family ever lived like that again. He glanced up at Emma, then at Marcus as if seeking understanding. That's why I built my company, to create opportunities for people who didn't have them. Yes, we drill for oil. Yes, we use resources that aren't sustainable in the long run. But those projects employ thousands of workers, people who depend on those paychecks to feed their families. If I shut everything down tomorrow to go green, what happens to them? His question hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. Emma frowned, clearly conflicted. She wanted to argue, to point out that transitioning to renewable energy could still create jobs, but she hesitated. Something about Richard's honesty disarmed her, making it harder to dismiss him as just another greedy executive. Marcus watched the shift in dynamics with quiet satisfaction. He knew moments like this were rare, when defenses dropped and raw truths came to light. Still, he sensed there was more beneath the surface, more pain and fear driving both sides of the argument. To encourage further openness, he decided to share a piece of his own story. You know, Marcus said slowly, leaning back against the counter. I've seen things from 35,000 feet that most people only read about. Glaciers retreating, forests burning, cities choking on smog. But nothing hit me harder than losing my daughter. His voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat before continuing. Her name was Lily. She was 8 when she developed severe asthma. Doctors said it was triggered by pollution in our neighborhood. No matter how many filters we installed or how careful we were, it wasn't enough. By the time she turned 16, her lungs were too damaged. She passed away last year. The room fell silent. Neither Richard nor Emma knew what to say. They hadn't expected this, the stoic pilot revealing such profound grief. Marcus blinked rapidly, composing himself before speaking again. Lily's death is why I care so much about these issues. It's why I listen to debates like yours, hoping someone will figure out how to fix what's broken. Because the truth is, neither side has all the answers. We need solutions that protect the planet and the people who live on it. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, visibly affected by Marcus's words. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again, unsure of what to say. Finally, he settled on a simple statement. I'm sorry about your daughter. I can't imagine what that must feel like. Thank you, Marcus replied, nodding gratefully. Then, turning to Emma, he added, and thank you for sharing your story, too. Hearing about your hometown. It reminds me of places I've flown over, places that are changing faster than anyone expected. Emma nodded, her earlier fire tempered by empathy. I'm sorry about your granddaughter, she said softly to Richard, referring to the allergy struggles he'd mentioned earlier. I didn't mean to imply that you don't care, I get frustrated sometimes seeing companies put profits ahead of people. Richard sighed, rubbing his temples as if trying to process everything. I understand why you're frustrated, he admitted. Hell, sometimes I'm frustrated with myself. Running a business isn't black and white. Every decision feels like a trade-off. Do I prioritize shareholders or the environment? Jobs today or a livable planet tomorrow? He shook his head, looking genuinely torn. I wish it were easier to do the right thing. For the first time since the flight began, the tension in the galley eased. The three of them sat in silence for a while, each lost in their thoughts. Outside, the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting golden light through the windows. The hum of the engines provided a soothing backdrop, a reminder that despite their differences, they were all part of the same journey. Marcus broke the quiet after a few minutes. You know, maybe the problem isn't that we disagree, he mused aloud. Maybe it's that we've stopped listening to each other. If we could find common ground, if we could focus on shared goals instead of pointing fingers, we might actually stand a chance. Emma and Richard exchanged a glance, hesitant but curious. There was still plenty of distance between their perspectives, but for the first time, they seemed willing to consider bridging it. The debate wasn't over, not by a long shot. But in that cramped little galley, suspended miles above the earth, Something remarkable had begun to take shape, the possibility of understanding. The fragile sense of understanding that had begun to form in the galley was shattered moments later, when Richard casually dropped a bombshell. As the conversation shifted toward specific examples of corporate responsibility, or lack thereof, Emma pressed him on his company's recent activities. "What about your involvement in that drilling project in Alaska?" she asked, her tone sharp but controlled. "How do you justify funding something so destructive?" Richard hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of her question. He glanced at Marcus, then back at Emma, his expression unreadable. For a moment it seemed like he might deflect or downplay the issue, but instead he sighed heavily and admitted, "Yes, my company is involved in that project. It wasn't my idea. It was pushed through by shareholders who wanted quick returns. But I can't deny that it's happening under my watch." Emma's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're one of those CEOs," she shot back, her voice rising sharply. "You talk about creating jobs and helping communities, but projects like that are destroying ecosystems and displacing indigenous people. How can you claim to care about the future when you're actively making things worse?" Her words hit like a punch, and Richard visibly bristled. "That's not fair," he snapped, his earlier vulnerability replaced by defensiveness. "I didn't say I agreed with everything my company does, but if I step away from these decisions, someone else will take over, and they won't give a damn about balance or compromise. At least I'm trying to find middle ground." "Middle ground?" Emma retorted, standing abruptly. Her chair scraped against the floor, drawing startled looks from nearby passengers peeking into the galley. "There is no middle ground when it comes to destroying the planet for profit. You're either part of the solution or part of the problem, and right now you're clearly part of the problem." The tension in the air became suffocating. Marcus stepped forward instinctively, placing a hand on Emma's shoulder in an attempt to calm her. "Let's take a breath here," he said firmly but gently. "This isn't helping anyone." But Emma shrugged him off, her frustration boiling over. "No, Captain Hale, this is helping. Someone needs to call out hypocrisy when they see it. People like Richard sit in their ivory towers pretending to care while lining their pockets with blood money." She turned back to Richard, her voice trembling with emotion. "You don't care about people or the planet, you only care about profit." The accusation hung in the air like a thundercloud, heavy and unrelenting. Richard's face flushed red. Whether from anger or shame, it was hard to tell. He stood up as well, towering over Emma despite her fiery determination. "That's rich coming from someone who's never built anything in her life," he shot back, his voice cutting through the confined space. "You sit there preaching about change, but what have you actually done? Written some articles? Given a few speeches? That doesn't put food on anyone's table." Emma flinched as though struck, her confidence wavering for the first time. "At least I'm fighting for something bigger than myself," she countered, weakly though her voice lacked its previous conviction. Marcus stepped between them, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Enough," he said, his voice firm enough to command attention. "This isn't getting us anywhere. Both of you need to stop attacking each other and start listening." For a moment, neither Richard nor Emma moved. Their breathing was heavy, their faces flushed with emotion. The rest of the cabin had gone eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of the engines. Passengers exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether the confrontation would escalate further. Even the flight attendants hovered nearby, ready to intervene if necessary. Seeing the situation spiraling out of control, Marcus made a split-second decision. "Sit down," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, both Richard and Emma complied, sinking back into their seats with simmering resentment. Marcus took a deep breath, running a hand through his graying hair as he tried to gather his thoughts. "Look," he began, his voice softer now but still authoritative. "I get it. Both of you feel passionately about your positions and neither of you is wrong for caring deeply. But hurling accusations and insults isn't going to solve anything. If we want to move forward, we need to focus on solutions, not blame." Emma crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her jaw clenched in defiance. Richard mirrored her posture, though his expression betrayed a flicker of regret. Neither spoke, but the intensity of their gazes suggested they were far from ready to reconcile. Determined to salvage the conversation, Marcus decided to shift the focus. "Let's try something different," he proposed. "Instead of arguing about what's already been done, let's talk about what could be done. Richard, what steps is your company taking or willing to take to reduce its environmental impact? And Emma, what alternatives would you suggest that could also support workers and communities?" It was a risky move, asking two polarized individuals to collaborate, but Marcus hoped it might steer them toward constructive dialogue. To his relief, Richard was the first to respond, albeit hesitantly. "We've started investing in carbon capture technology," he admitted, his voice quieter. "Now, it's expensive and still in development, but it has potential. And yes, I know it's not enough, but it's a start." Emma raised an eyebrow skeptically but nodded slowly. "Carbon capture is better than nothing," she conceded, choosing her words carefully. "But it's not a substitute for cutting emissions at the source. Have you considered transitioning some of your operations to renewable energy? There are grants and incentives available for companies willing to make that leap." Richard frowned, clearly weighing her suggestion. "It's not as simple as flipping a switch," he replied. "Renewables require massive upfront costs and the infrastructure isn't always in place, but maybe it's worth exploring further." Their exchange was tentative, almost cautious, but it marked a significant shift. Gone was the hostility that had dominated earlier. In its place was a fragile willingness to explore possibilities. Marcus watched silently, feeling a glimmer of hope. This wasn't resolution, it was barely even progress, but it was a step in the right direction. As the conversation continued, both Richard and Emma began to soften, inching closer to common ground without fully realizing it. They weren't friends, not yet, but they were no longer enemies either. In that cramped little galley miles above the earth, the seeds of understanding had been planted. Whether they would grow into something meaningful remained to be seen. But for now, the storm had passed, leaving behind a fragile calm. The fragile calm that had settled over the galley was about to be shattered once again. But this time it wasn't anger or accusations driving the tension. Instead, it was vulnerability. As Richard and Emma cautiously began exploring solutions, Marcus noticed a subtle shift in their body language. The rigid postures softened. Their voices dropped from defensive tones to something closer to curiosity. It was as if the weight of their earlier arguments had worn them down, leaving behind raw honesty. Richard leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped tightly together. "You know," he said hesitantly, breaking the brief silence that followed, "Emma's suggestion about renewable energy, there's something I haven't told you." He glanced at Marcus first, then at Emma, his expression uneasy. "My granddaughter, she's 7 years old. She has severe allergies, like I mentioned before, but they've gotten worse every year. Doctors say it's because of air quality." Emma's eyes widened slightly, her skepticism giving way to surprise. "I didn't realize it was that serious," she admitted softly. Her tone lacked its earlier sharpness, replaced by genuine concern. "That must be hard for her and for your family." Richard nodded, looking away for a moment as though gathering his thoughts. When he spoke again, his voice carried a heaviness that hadn't been there before. "It is. Every time she struggles to breathe, it feels like I'm failing her somehow. And deep down, I know part of the reason she's suffering is because of decisions my company has made, or at least decisions I haven't fought hard enough against." He paused, swallowing hard. "I tell myself I'm doing what I have to do to keep people employed, but sometimes I wonder if I'm just making excuses." The confession hung in the air, heavy and unexpected. Emma stared at him, her earlier frustration melting into something akin to empathy. For all her passion and conviction, she couldn't deny the pain in Richard's voice or the guilt etched across his face. It was clear that his involvement in environmentally harmful projects wasn't just a matter of greed or indifference. It was complicated, tangled up with fear, responsibility, and love. Before she could respond, Marcus spoke up gently. Takes courage to admit that, he said, his tone warm but firm. Acknowledging the harm we've caused or allowed isn't easy, but it's also the first step toward fixing it. Richard gave a small, rueful smile. Fixing it isn't going to be easy either, he muttered. Even if I wanted to shut down every unsustainable project tomorrow, which I can't, there'd still be backlash. Shareholders would revolt. Employees would lose jobs and... He trailed off, shaking his head. It's not as simple as wanting to do the right thing. Emma listened intently, her arms still crossed but no longer in defiance. After a moment, she sighed deeply, leaning back in her seat. You're right. It's not simple, she conceded. And maybe I've oversimplified things too. I get so caught up in fighting for change that I forget how messy reality can be. She hesitated, glancing down at her hands. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Her admission surprised even herself. For someone who prided herself on being steadfast and unyielding, admitting doubt felt foreign and terrifying. Yet as she looked at Richard, seeing the conflict etched on his face, she realized that maybe they weren't so different after all. Both of them wanted a better future. They just approached it from opposite sides of a vast divide. Taking a deep breath, Emma continued, her voice quieter now, but full of sincerity. I'll admit, I don't always think about the human cost of transitioning away from fossil fuels. I focus on the big picture, the planet, the ecosystems, the generations to come. But I forget that real people are affected along the way. People like your workers, people like your granddaughter. She met Richard's gaze directly, holding it despite the lump rising in her throat. I'm sorry if I came across as dismissive earlier, that wasn't fair. Richard blinked in surprise, clearly unprepared for her apology. For a moment, he simply stared at her, searching her face for any trace of insincerity. Finding none, he nodded slowly. Thank you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. And I'm sorry, too, for dismissing your concerns. You're right. We can't keep kicking the can down the road. Sooner or later, we'll run out of road. The words hung between them, simple yet profound. In that moment, something shifted. Not dramatically, not completely, but enough to create a crack in the wall separating their worlds. They weren't allies yet, but they were no longer adversaries either. They were two people standing on shaky ground, trying to find footing together. Marcus watched silently, feeling a swell of pride mixed with relief. This wasn't the resolution he'd envisioned when he first stepped into the galley. But it was progress, and sometimes, progress was enough. Still, he knew the conversation wasn't finished. There was one more piece missing. One more layer of truth waiting to surface. Clearing his throat, Marcus turned to Emma. What about you? He asked gently. Is there anything you haven't shared? Something personal that drives you? Emma froze for a split second, caught off guard by the question. She opened her mouth to deflect, to offer another statistic or anecdote about climate change, but stopped herself. Slowly, she exhaled, her shoulders slumping slightly as she prepared to reveal a part of herself she rarely showed to anyone. When I started doing this work, she began haltingly, I thought I was invincible, like I could take on the world and win. But the truth is, I'm scared, all the time. She laughed bitterly, running a hand through her hair. I read reports about sea levels rising, temperatures climbing, species disappearing, and I feel this crushing sense of helplessness. What if everything I'm doing isn't enough? What if no matter how loud I shout or how hard I fight, it's already too late? Her voice cracked on the last word, and she quickly looked away, blinking back tears. Richard watched her, his expression softening further. Even Marcus, who had seen countless moments of vulnerability in his life, felt his heart ache for her. Beneath her fiery exterior lay a young woman burdened by the weight of the world, a burden far too heavy for anyone to carry alone. I see it in the mirror sometimes, Emma added quietly, almost to herself. This girl who's trying so hard to save everyone else but can't even save herself. Some days I wonder if I'm cut out for this fight. But then I remember why I started. to honor the people and places I've lost. And I force myself to keep going. The honesty in her words resonated deeply with both men. Richard reached out impulsively, placing a hand on hers. "You're stronger than you think," he said earnestly, "and you're not alone. Whether you believe me or not, I want to help. Not because I owe you an apology, but because my granddaughter deserves a future where she can breathe freely." Emma looked at him, startled by the gesture but undeniably moved. For the first time since boarding the flight, she saw Richard not as an opponent but as a potential partner, someone who, despite their differences, shared her desire for a better world. Tentatively, she smiled, her lips trembling slightly. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's figure it out together." The agreement was tentative, fragile, and fraught with uncertainty, but it was a beginning. As the three of them sat in the cramped galley miles above the earth, they realized that solutions wouldn't come easily. Bridging divides required patience, humility, and trust, all qualities in short supply in today's polarized world. But for now, they had taken the first step, and sometimes that was all that mattered. As the plane descended toward Los Angeles, the golden light of sunset streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the cabin. In the galley, the atmosphere had transformed entirely from what it had been just an hour earlier. Gone was the tension that had crackled between Richard and Emma. In its place was a quiet understanding, tentative but genuine. The three of them sat together, their earlier animosity replaced by a shared sense of purpose. Fragile, yes, but undeniably present. Richard leaned back against the counter, his arms crossed loosely over his chest. For the first time since the flight began, he looked less like a corporate titan defending his empire and more like a man grappling with difficult truths. "You know," he said thoughtfully, breaking the comfortable silence, "I never expected to have this conversation on a plane. But maybe that's fitting. We're all up here, floating above everything, seeing the world from a different perspective." Emma nodded, her fiery red hair catching the warm glow of the setting sun. She smiled faintly, though there was still a trace of uncertainty in her eyes. "It's funny how life works sometimes," she replied softly. "I boarded this flight thinking I'd spend 6 hours reading reports and preparing for my next speech. Instead," she trailed off, glancing at Richard and then at Marcus. "Instead, I think I might have learned something important." Marcus chuckled warmly, the lines around his eyes crinkling as he grinned. "That makes 2 of us," he said, his voice tinged with amusement. "I wasn't planning on playing mediator today, or sharing personal stories, but here we are." He paused, looking at both of them with a mix of pride and hope. Sometimes the most meaningful conversations happen when you least expect them. The descent brought a gentle rocking motion to the aircraft, signaling that their journey was nearing its end. As the seatbelt sign dinged on overhead, the trio reluctantly prepared to return to their respective seats. Before they parted ways, however, Richard extended a hand toward Emma. "Look," he began, his tone earnest. "I can't promise I'll change everything overnight, but I will review those proposals you mentioned, the ones about renewable energy and sustainable practices. And if there's anything else you think my company could do better, I want to hear it." Emma hesitated for only a moment before shaking his hand firmly. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling beneath the surface. "And I'll try to be more mindful about the human side of these issues. If we're going to make real progress, we need solutions that work for everyone, not just the environment." Their handshake lingered for a beat longer than necessary, a silent acknowledgement of the bridge they had begun to build. It wasn't perfect, and neither of them harbored illusions that their differences would vanish overnight, but they had taken a step forward, a small but significant one. As they made their way back to their seats, Marcus returned to the cockpit, his mind buzzing with reflection. The autopilot had handled much of the flight, but now it was time for him to take control again, guiding the massive aircraft safely to the ground. Yet as he adjusted the controls and communicated with air traffic control, his thoughts kept drifting, back to the conversation in the galley. He couldn't help but marvel at how quickly perceptions could shift when people chose to listen instead of argue. Richard and Emma had started the flight as adversaries, entrenched in opposing ideologies. By the end, they had found common ground, not because either of them had abandoned their beliefs, but because they had recognized the humanity in each other. They weren't friends, not yet, but they were no longer enemies either. When the wheels of Flight 347 touched down on the runway, the jolt sent a ripple of movement through the cabin. Passengers stirred, gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. Outside, the sprawling city of Los Angeles stretched out beneath a pink and orange sky, its lights beginning to twinkle as night fell. The hum of engines slowed to a low whine, and the pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles. Thank you for flying with us today, and we hope you enjoyed your journey." For most passengers, the announcement was routine, a signal to stand up and stretch after hours of sitting. But for Richard, Emma, and Marcus, the words carried extra weight. Their journey hadn't just been physical, it had been emotional, intellectual, even transformative. As they filed out of the plane, none of the other travelers suspected the profound exchange that had unfolded thousands of feet above the earth. To the casual observer, it was just another flight. But for the three of them, it was a turning point. At the gate, Richard paused near the exit, turning to face Emma. "If you're ever in New York," he said, surprising himself with the offer, "let me know. Maybe we can continue this discussion. Over coffee or lunch if you're willing to give me another chance." Emma smiled genuinely this time. "I'd like that," she replied. Then, after a brief hesitation, she added, "And thank you for listening. I know it wasn't easy." Richard nodded, tipping an imaginary hat before stepping into the terminal. Emma watched him go, feeling a strange mix of relief and anticipation. She glanced around, spotting Marcus farther ahead, chatting briefly with a flight attendant. Catching her eye, he gave her a subtle nod and a smile, as if to say, "See? Progress is possible." Once outside, Emma took a deep breath of the cool evening air, letting it fill her lungs. The weight she had carried onto the flight still lingered, but it felt lighter somehow, as though sharing her fears and frustrations had eased the burden, even if only slightly. She pulled out her phone and sent a quick text to her colleague. "Got some new ideas during the flight. Let's talk tomorrow." Meanwhile, Richard stood by the curb waiting for his car service. He scrolled through emails on his phone, stopping when one caught his attention. An update on the Alaska drilling project. Normally, he would have skimmed it quickly and moved on, but now he read it carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration. When the car arrived, he climbed inside, already drafting a message to his board of directors. "We need to revisit our sustainability goals," he typed, "starting now." Back in the terminal, Marcus lingered for a moment, watching the stream of passengers disappear into the crowd. His role as captain was complete, but his role as a facilitator of change, if only a small part of it, felt far from over. He thought about Lily, his daughter, and the legacy she had left behind. Her absence still ached, but today, for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps the battles facing the world weren't insurmountable after all, not if people were willing to meet halfway, to see beyond their own perspectives. With a final glance at the bustling airport, Marcus turned and walked toward the crew lounge, ready to debrief and prepare for his next flight. As he disappeared into the corridor, the echoes of the day's events stayed with him, a reminder that even high above the clouds, connections could be forged, bridges could be built, and hearts could open. And so, the story of Flight 347 came to an end, not with fanfare or dramatic resolution, but with quiet determination. Three strangers, brought together by chance, had chosen to listen instead of judge, to understand instead of condemn. It wasn't a miracle cure for the world's problems, but it was a start, and sometimes that was enough.